Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a musician, author, and braided essayist. His braided essay, Hamlet and The Libertine, with a preface on modern music, was published as a book. He has also written the book Love Looks Not with the Eyes but with the Mind, Shakespeare's Sonnets, Alchemy and Individuation. His name is William John Titus Bishop, and my interview with William will follow the note-taking sounds. William John Titus Bishop, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Aaron, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
I am a UK-based performing and recording artist, and I also have authored a number of books. I'm working on a third book at the moment, alongside a third studio album.
You said you've written 2 books that have been published so far. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Without spoiling too much of the first 2 books you've written, what are they about?
Those books were written at the time I was studying, and I was studying English literature at Sussex University and at York University. And it was during that course of study that I decided that I wanted to write a book on what I was studying, and I wanted that book to be accessible to a non-academic audience. So I wanted to take some of the stuff that I was doing in an academic context and to make that relevant to a non-academic audience.
Now, one of your books is it's a braided essay titled Hamlet and The Libertine with a preface on modern music. What is your other book called?
The first piece I published was on Shakespeare's Sonnets. It was on Shakespeare's Sonnets and Freudian psychology. It's called Shakespeare's Sonnets, Alchemy and Individuation. And I think that's available on Amazon and on most of the online retailers, and in some bookstores as well. I think Barnes & Noble stock it as well.
Your braided essay is titled Hamlet and the Libertine with a preface on modern music. Without spoiling too much about your braided essay, what is it about? And also, if you could elaborate a little bit on what a braided essay is, that would also help our listeners.
Oh, sure. These are good questions, by the way. Thank you. That particular piece is an exploration of some ideas that come up in Hamlet, which is obviously one of Shakespeare's most famous plays, and how that relates to libertinism, which is a kind of something that came out of sort of the British monarchy just after Shakespeare was around. So just after Shakespeare and the Elizabethan period had finished, the libertines came along. And they were had a very sort of hedonistic outlook on life. And the book kind of compares and contrasts the two philosophies. It's a braided essay in the sense that it's an essay which has been made public. So it's not just for an academic audience. So it reads more like a personal essay rather than a piece which was meant for universities.
What do you love most about the works of William Shakespeare as well as the works of John Wilmot, who was one of the libertines, if I recall correctly?
John Wilmot was probably the most prominent and the most publicized libertine. He was, if you've ever seen the film, there was a film recently, well, it must be a few years ago now, with Johnny Depp and John Malkovich, called The Libertine. And that was a sort of a Hollywood film that was made out of this particular restoration figure. And he was around in a period where their outlook on life was very much more hedonistic and more pleasure centered. They were very much about the pursuit of pleasure and about enjoyment and about anything to do with sort of opulence and overindulgence. They were very much into that lifestyle, and it contrasted very much with what Shakespeare was doing and what Shakespeare was writing about and what was happening previously to that in the Elizabethan period. And it's interesting to look, and it's very interesting to see the way that those two philosophies actually compare to each other. And that's kind of really what the text is about.
What is the easiest and hardest aspect of writing a braided essay for you?
Because my writing background was in academics, so I'd always been taught to write in a specific way. I'd always been taught to write an essay in a specific way, and there was a way to write an essay, and that was it. And it had to conform to a certain, to a certain format. It had to appear in a certain way, and it had to contain certain things, and it had to have certain conventions which made it an essay. It had to look a certain way, and that was how I had always been brought up to write. When I started thinking, right, I want to make this accessible to people who've never been in that sort of environment, I thought, right, I'm going to have to change the format. I'm going to have to change the way I write, and I'm going to have to kind of get rid of a lot of those conventions and a lot of those techniques which academics use, and I'm going to have to make it read more like a story, and I wanted to make it read more like a conversation or just a discussion which you'd have with your friends. A very casual conversation about these historical figures. And so I did have to consciously alter the way I was writing for that particular piece.
Jack Frost published Hamlet and The Libertine with a preface on modern music. What was it like to get your braided essay published as a book?
It was interesting. It was interesting to me because it was meant to be a piece that was for academic journals and for universities. It was meant to be a piece which it was never really meant to. It was never really meant to be. Well, it was never really meant to be received outside of that environment. And taking that to a publisher was difficult because books which are basically about academic subjects are more difficult to market. A publisher many publishers have said this to me, that that subject matter is more difficult to market. It does have a smaller audience. So it can be slightly more challenging to find a publisher who will pick that up and is willing to market and distribute that. But there were a number of publishers who were interested. But I think you have to be very conscious of the fact that you are marketing to a very specific audience, and a lot of publishers aren't going to be particularly receptive to that.
Do you plan on, or are you considering writing more essays, longer length books, or both? And if so, what are some ideas for essays or books that you will or may write?
I certainly do. I was fortunate enough that that the last piece was well received by the public. Fortunately, it's got some good reception from from the broader reading public, and that was quite encouraging. And so I do plan to write some more essays and a longer book length piece, a longer, more sort of, the last two pieces were shorter books, what would be considered short books. But I do plan to write a much longer piece, as well as a number of essays as well. Certainly this year, if you do like any of that stuff, if you do pick up, they don't take long to read, these pieces. That you could read them in less than a day quite easily. And but if they do spark your interest in any way, then there will be more of the same coming out later on this year.
Now I'm going to dive into some questions regarding your work as a musician and a songwriter, and I'll start with your work as a musician. What genre or genres of songs do you perform? Who are some musicians who have influenced your work as a musician, and what are some of your more notable songs?
Okay, I write mostly, my background is in classical music, but I chose not to pursue classical music. Once I left school, I chose to pursue folk music, indie folk music, and pop music more generally. And so I guess indie pop or indie folk is the genre which I write music in. I would hope that there is something there. If you have a look on my website, which is williamjohntitusbishop.com, or you have a look on Spotify or Apple Music or whichever service you like to use, or YouTube is a fantastic one as well because there's videos there as well. If any of those services which you find easiest to use, if you log onto those and look up William John Titus Bishop, there are songs there which I hope will appeal to anyone. I like to think that everything I write has something different in it and has something which can appeal to a different audience. So I hope if you have a listen and stick with some of the songs, then you will find something that you like. The most recent release was called Second Time Around, and that's a more sort of a more vintage folk sort of feel. So I'd start with that one if you're interested.
As a songwriter, you write on both the guitar and the piano. What are some notable differences between songwriting on those two instruments?
That's a fantastic question. It's a lot easier to write a piano ballad and to write a song for a solo piano. There are a lot of songs out there which work very well, just a voice and a piano. The more sort of melancholy, introspective piano songs, piano ballads, they are much easier to write because the piano seems to be more suited to solo piano, seems to be more suited to that kind of introspective, soul-searching sort of song. So in a way, it's easier to write on a piano in that sense. With a guitar, if you're just using one guitar and it's just a solo guitar piece, it's very difficult to make that sound interesting. A solo guitar, it is very difficult to make that sound to hold people's attention for long enough to get a song out of it. It's just one guy and a guitar is difficult to make that sound interesting enough to hold people's attention, which is why I like to involve other musicians. And normally I just write the lyrics, and then I write the very simple structure of the song on guitar or piano. So there is the idea of the song, and then I take that to other musicians in a studio, and that fills out the sound. But certainly, I think if it's just a voice and a piano, a voice and an instrument, for a soloist, certainly a piano is easier because you can get that sort of melancholy ballad sort of imagined by John Lennon, for example. You get that sort of feel on a piano, which is a lot easier to do.
The lyrics of your songs have been described as having a harsh honesty to them. Why is that?
I don't intentionally sort of, I just write down. I can sit down and write, and what comes out, I put on record. I don't sort of consciously think I'm going to be, sort of soul-searchingly honest. I don't think, sort of going to be, I don't think I'm going to be sort of, I'm not sort of sitting down thinking, right, I'm going to bare my soul now to the world. That's not the process that I use when I write songs. But I do think that music and art in general, if you like, or kind of different mediums of expression, so painting, theatre, music, I think that does give people a space to express things which they wouldn't normally feel comfortable doing in a more formal social context. So I think it's important that that harsh honesty comes across and that it is in the right context, because I think that's the right place for it. If you're going to do something which is a little bit, kind of shocking maybe, then I think that there is a place for that. And the right place for that is music and painting and all those forms of self-expression.
Is there anything in common between what motivates you to write the written word and what motivates you to write music? And if so, what is it?
Obviously, there's a difference between writing and the written word and music and the and sort of making music, performing music and writing something. And obviously, they're different things. But because a song tends to be, it would be easy to write just a piece of classical music, just for a string quartet or something, and then you'd have no lyrics, and it would just be a perfectly good standalone piece of music. At the same time, it would be perfectly easy to write a poem and publish that, and it would be perfectly good on its own. You wouldn't need music necessarily. Both those things work on their own. But the thing about a song is that it contains both those elements. So you have to include both, really, if you want to write a sort of a song, especially popular music. Even going back to ballads and sort of folk music and songs going back centuries, there was always an element of words and music. So it was someone speaking or someone singing accompanied by an instrument. And I think you have to have both for a song, but both those elements work perfectly well independently.
William, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You are a wonderful and interesting guest to interview.
Thank you so much for having me. The questions were fantastic. Yes, I've had a great time. Thank you.
I need to start writing braided essays of my own, to be honest. With that said, this is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2025, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.